my first question is about the book Why Liberty? So in the very first chapter you begin by describing being a libertarian as something which compares to just being a nice guy. And this, at least in Greece, would sound quite strange because libertarians are thought of like being heartless, hard-headed, selfish, anything but nice guys. So can you explain to us a little bit about what you mean?
Sure. A nice guy may not be the best term, but to be respectful of other people, to recognize you're not the only human being in the world, that other people exist. They have lives, they have interests, and they have rights. And so the key to a libertarian philosophy is not to only assert your own interests. People do that naturally enough under every political system. But to respect the interests, the rights of other people. To me, that is really the heart. So to take a simple example, I don't smoke marijuana. I don't like it. But I don't approve of other people being put in prison because they own a plant. This seems to me simply wrong. And so I've worked very hard for legalization of marijuana. It doesn't affect me personally. I don't smoke it, so I'm not going to go to prison. But when other people are arrested and punished, it really hurts my heart because it shows disrespect for them. It shows disrespect for their humanity. So the libertarian idea is basically to respect other people and to love the freedom of other people as much as you love your own. You might think of 3 simple principles that most people teach their children as they're growing up. Number 1, don't hit other people. Number 2, don't steal their stuff from them. Number 3, don't lie to people. So we could see these in a political context, that the state should not initiate aggression or force against people, should not confiscate from them what is theirs, and should keep promises and enforce contracts. Those are pretty basic ideas.
You are talking about, you're tracing these ideas back to the end of the Dark Ages, on the idea that city-states in Europe defined the idea of civilization, and you connect the word city with the word civilization. And while translating this, I realized that the same is true with Greek. So polis, which is city, has the same root with politismos, which is civilization. So apparently there is no accident that it's both true in Latin and in Greek.
Yes.
And based on that, I thought that what happened in ancient Greece is like democracy came out of small city-states, like the ideas of liberalism came out at the end of the Dark Ages in Central Europe. And do you think that this is an accident, or is there some connection between like small independent states and like democracy and liberalism?
It's not so much a question of being small, but the ability of people to go from one to another. And this was characteristic of European civilization. It was highly decentralized. There were not such great, gigantic empires, and people could move from one place to another. Even in the context of the Roman Empire, which was, of course, quite gigantic, a huge area, all of the Mediterranean, France, even England, people could move from place to place, and there was great variety in local governance. So this is a very important principle, is competition for the provision of public order. Generally, centralized empires do not generate liberty. We think about the Ming dynasty in China, Ming and followed by Qing dynasty. We think about the Russian Empire under the Tsars, or the Ottoman Empire, 3 of the great political systems of the Eurasian landmass, highly centralized, not much liberty came out of them. Little Europe, in some ways a kind of backwater for much of human history, developed a highly decentralized political system in which people could move from place to place. And so rulers would offer more freedom to attract people to come and live there, work there, to attract artisans and so on. So that's really the key. Now, of course, Greece has a very special role in that story as well. in especially Athens. That is to say that there were institutions of democracy understood not merely as majority rule, but when the Clycenic reforms were introduced, the principle of freedom of speech and of isonomia were very important for the constitutional development. The people could go and speak publicly, and even if they lost the debate, they would not be punished for their speech. That was really an important innovation. And it was right here, just over this window in the Agora, that these principles were developed. Those are connected to modern libertarian ideas. But institutionally, there was of course a break between the classical civilization and modern civilization of the Dark Ages. And so that's why in that chapter I made the connection with the re-emergence of urban civilization in Europe. In many ways what it meant was reappropriating the ideas that had been developed in the Greek cities thousands of years earlier, and then reintroducing them in a different institutional context.
What about the European Union? So it's like also like a huge entity. So does the European Union help preserve libertarian principles, or are we going on the opposite question, opposite way? So what do you think about that?
It's a complicated question, and you might describe me as moderately Eurosceptical, but not extreme, in the following way. I think that the development of a common market, meaning that goods and labor can go across borders without having to have additional barriers and burdens, is very important. And that does tend to generate greater competition, and the outcome of that is normally more freedom and more respect for people. The problem is that there has been a tendency in more recent years for over-centralization, and instead of harmony, what they call harmonization, which is a kind of coercive implementation of single standards on all countries. This, I think, is a terrible mistake. Tax harmonization is one example. It's really an attempt to create a tax cartel, which is to say, at the highest level of taxation. The European Union is involved in this. I should also say the United States government is cooperating with the European Union to try to capture people and make sure that they are put under the highest possible taxation. And as you know, the United States government does something even worse. They tax their citizens based on their worldwide income. So even if someone has not lived in the United States for 40 years, every year he or she must file a tax return and pay American taxes. So I think generally the movement for free trade area in Europe has been very, very positive. But the attempt in more recent years to create harmonization has had very, very bad and negative consequences. So it's a mixed deal. I think that the idea of a free trade Europe should be resurrected, but the idea of a harmonized Europe should be rejected. Well, the most important point is the rule of law is a very important part of the libertarian view. That what is important is not the will of the ruler, or your personal characteristics or mine, speaking Greek or Italian or Polish or German, or being Christian or Muslim or Jewish or tall or short, but what is the law? And the law is what should be supreme rather than the will of a human being. That said, it's very important that the laws be easily understood, clear, and basically as simple as possible. The alternative approach, you see a problem, there must be a special law for that problem, undermines the rule of law. It means instead of having law, you just have contradictory commands and edicts. And one consequence of so many laws or commands is you cannot follow all of them. People then choose which ones to break and which ones to follow. That basically destroys the very concept and idea of law. It's fundamentally, people who are obsessed with laws and think there should be a law for every problem are in fact the enemies of law. They create disregard for law. They generate a society in which everyone is guilty all the time of breaking some law, and the consequence is they pick and choose which ones to obey. If you really believe in the rule of law, the law should be simple, They should be clearly understood by people, at least those involved in area of expertise. There are specialized mercantile and banking laws, but it cannot be a law that no banker would understand. It should be understood by those engaged, at least in the trade. And they should be clearly transparent. Unfortunately, when you look at the code of legal regulations, tens of thousands of pages, many of them require contradictory actions. You could not possibly do all of them because they actually contradict each other. So in my opinion, this is a substitute of tyranny in place of law and superstition in place of reason. People who always want to pass another law, in effect, believe in superstition or magic. They think if you pass the law, the problem will go away. That's sufficient, like a magician, Merlin the magician. He says the magic words and the food appears or the problem disappears. The world isn't like that. Law should be rules of behavior that generate predictable consequences. They help us to coordinate our behavior. So traffic laws are an example of that. Even with all the chaos of driving, millions of people, each one going a different place, simple rules that everyone can understand about stoplights, about if you come to a crossway, who stops, who gives preference to the other one. Those are simple. Pretty much anyone can understand them. And they generate complex patterns of social coordination. One person is going to school, another person is going to the market, someone is visiting their parents, all going to different places. And simple rules help them to coordinate their behavior. But imagine if we had a special law for visiting your parents, and another law to help you get to school, and another law to go to the market. This would generate complete chaos and disorder. So rules or laws should be simple, clear, and capable of being followed, rather than multiplying more and more and more and more in order to allegedly solve problems. That's a failure to understand the function of law. Well, if you think about spontaneous order, it's something that we observe in nature, we observe it in chemistry, in physics, even in mathematics, that certain simple foundations, a simple equation can yield a very complex geometrical form. In biology, a forest or a swamp or an ocean has an ecology. It has its own order that we can understand, but it does not require someone creating the order at any given moment. It's natural for the human mind, when we see order, we ask, well, who created the order? Someone must have created that. And sometimes that's true. Gardens are beautiful because gardeners make them that way. Buildings are beautiful because architects and engineers construct them. But much of the order in the world wasn't designed specifically by anyone for that function or purpose. An ecology emerges, develops, grows, changes, but also human institutions. Language, as an example. Language is a spontaneous order. It changes, new words are introduced. English is always adopting new words from other languages. Even German adopts words from English and Russian and so on. This is natural. When you try to freeze a language so it doesn't change, you kill it. Latin is a dead language now. Greek is a living language, and Greek is changing and evolving in new ways. Similarly with the economy is a spontaneous order. You don't need to have a central planner to make sure that there's bread in the store and that there's milk in the store, or there are automobile tires in places when you want to go buy tires for your car. That was tried. Central planning was a total failure. In fact, you find when there was central planning, there was chaos and disorder. And when there was no central planning, but basic simple rules, that's where you get economic complexity and economic order. So all across human behavior, we see spontaneous order as well. Now, it seems strange to people, because I think our minds are wired. We see order, we look for the order. It's just like when you look up at a cloud, you normally see faces. Our minds are structured to look for faces. We see them in clouds, we see them in rocks, and so on. I think it's because babies are looking for the face of the mother when they look up. So our minds expect a face when we look someplace into a cloud. And similarly, we expect when we see order to find someone who made it. The surprise is that much of the order emerged spontaneously. And yet, if you have the basic ground rules right, the order will generate more social cooperation than any conscious plan could have even imagined. If you gain 100 euros, someone must have lost 100 euros. So they balance out. In fact, zero-sum games are extremely rare. They almost never happen. Much more common in such a circumstance is a negative-sum game. A thief who takes 100 euros from someone usually causes far more damage to the person than 100 euros. So if a robber beats someone in the street, in the dark alley, and takes his wallet and stabs him, he gets 100 euros. But the victim suffered much greater consequences. That's a negative-sum game. The sum of the benefits is equal to a negative number. War is a negative-sum game. No one gained from World War I. This is a catastrophe. It was a complete disaster. Mostly wars are pure negative-sum games. But because many people think that the benefit of one comes at the expense of another, they're led to view others as their enemies. Jean-Baptiste Say, the great French economist, explained instead that the benefit of your neighbor can be to your benefit if you trade. And that's the key. So let's take an example. The Canadian-US border is the longest undefended border in the world. It's 4,000 miles long. No soldiers along it. There are hundreds of billions of dollars of trade going across that border regularly. Should Americans become angry because Canadians are becoming more prosperous? Or should Canadians become angry if Americans become more prosperous? Only if they're stupid. It's good for Americans when Canadians become wealthier. They can pay more for the things that they buy from Americans. And it's good for Americans when Canadians become more prosperous. They both benefit. The prosperity of one is to the advantage of the other if they trade. If they don't trade, that's a different story. What is it that creates peace? The greatest single predictor of peaceful relations between nations is the degree to which they trade. And there's a simple reason that we can understand intuitively. If you have a political border, and on this side is one person, on this side another, if they trade with each other, you now have a little voice for peace, because that person wants to continue the mutually beneficial exchange with the other. If they invest in each other's countries, you now have additional voices for peace. And the more people are trading and investing across that border, the more voices you have for peace and against war. It doesn't make war impossible, but it does make it less likely. And that is a very, very good thing. In the chapter by Eric Gartsky, who is a political scientist at the University of California, San Diego, he shows the general decline in violence and in war around the world, and it is strongly correlated with increase in trade. Trade is the most powerful antidote to war. And if you, as a factual matter, not a ideological or philosophical matter, as a matter of simple fact, people who favor peace should be strong advocates of free trade.
During the last years, there is an increase of economic activity between Greece and Turkey. So I think that this is a good example about what you're talking about. So, and I know that you traveled to Turkey and Greece, and you've visited both countries in the past. So, do you actually see a change regarding the relations of the two countries?
I do, and not only that, but also Turkey and all its neighbors further to the east as well. When people trade, they view the other person as a potential customer, and there's a very simple point. When you see other people as customers, you normally don't shoot them. You don't see shopkeepers, when someone comes in to buy, they shoot them or try to hurt them or send them away. You want to welcome customers. And so that creates more peaceful relations. I observed this firsthand in Iraqi Kurdistan when I was in Iraq. There had been such enmity between Turkish government and Kurds, as we know, very, very long-standing. But when that border became more open, what happened? Turkish businesses invested heavily in Kurdistan. Turkish restaurants, Turkish travel agencies, Turkish construction companies. And trade began across that border quite dramatically. The consequence was a dramatic lowering of the hostility. It's not zero by any means, but it lowered quite dramatically. So the best way to create peace between Turks and Armenians, Turks and Kurds, Turks and Greeks, is to increase the free voluntary exchange of goods and services and tourism and travel between the nations, which means that they can generate co-prosperity. They can prosper together. And if they do that, they're not going to see the other one as the enemy. Mm-hmm. I should also mention, when I was in India and Pakistan, exactly the same issue. And the Pakistani government initiated or reopened trade with India again. I had been there debating this question with people. Fortunately, at the end of it, they opened trade, but I cannot claim credit for doing that. There was a big debate in the society. Some people said, we will not trade with the Indians so long as 1 stone of Kashmir is under Indian control. And I told them, I said, okay, you can have that attitude. Your children's 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 children will be at war. If that's what you want, keep that attitude. But if you hope for peace and a peaceful resolution of the Kashmir question, start trading with the Indians. It's much better to send onions and carrots across the border rather than nuclear weapons and bombs.
So in the Greek translation of Peace, Love and Liberty, we've included one additional chapter written by Bijan Sahin, Turkish writer. And in this chapter, he mentions something that is really taboo both in Turkey and in Greece, that both people have done really bad things to each other. And he proposes that it doesn't really help either of us just to keep on talking about it or thinking about it, and we should move on. Yes. So do you think it's a good idea to try to avoid talking about the past, or how should we deal with this issue? So, because I believe that not understanding your past is bad for the future. So here is like a contradiction. So, or maybe it's not.
Well, I think one should talk about it, but to be honest about it. That's the key. And to recognize that there were victims. There were Greeks who were victims. There were also Turks who were victims who were expelled as well. So there can be victims on both sides. In Pakistan and India, there were victims. There were Indians and Pakistanis who suffered terribly. It was really terrible. Millions of people died during that awful, awful partition. If you address it in an honest way and say, yes, there were people on this side who committed crimes and people on that side. There were victims here and victims there. Let's admit this, and let's let the past be the past and live for the future of our children. I think that we saw something very important in South Africa during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings. They set a very high standard, and I think the world learned an important lesson. It's very important from a libertarian perspective as well. Even if you don't punish for those bad deeds in the past, bring them into the open. Let people acknowledge them. And when people did that, both people who were on the government enforcing apartheid and also on the ANC side, there were crimes committed against innocent people on both sides. They were openly discussed. And when that happens, you can now say, okay, now we open a new chapter and we move forward peacefully. So I don't think we should just ignore the past, but it doesn't make much sense to live always as if it were 200 years ago. Let's take some nearby countries in the Balkans. A famous writer once said that the Balkans have too much history. It's a funny expression. But what he meant by that was that people are always thinking it's 1396 and the Battle of the Field of Crows in Serbia. And if you always think it's 1396, you will always want to murder the neighbors. Think for the future. Don't just think about the past, but think about the future as well. Had the Serbian political leadership in the past, as well as Croatian and Bosnian and others, thought that way, they could have avoided a terrible, terrible set of crimes that happened in the Balkans, with so many innocent victims among all of the ethnic groups. No one was uniquely a victim, nor uniquely an aggressor. There were Serbian victims and there were Serbian aggressors, and true for every one of the ethnic groups. So acknowledge the past, but try to live for the future. That's, I think, the better philosophy.
Let's stay a little bit in Turkey. So I know that you've recently been there, and I've also have Turkish friends visiting me here in Athens, and they're really, really worried about Erdogan and the way that politics evolve in Turkey. So what is your understanding about that? So are you worried?
Some of our Turkish friends talk about the history of the deep state, for example, in Turkey, that is not visible on the surface, but is quite powerful nonetheless, of the army, security apparatus, bureaucracy, and judiciary. I do think that there has been a tendency from Mr. Erdogan to want to be the big man, and to gather all the power into himself and so on. This is not uncommon for politicians. Once you're in office for too long, it goes to your head, and you decide that you are really as great as your press releases describe you. This is very dangerous. And I think we're seeing an example of this. Look at the unbelievable house he's had built for himself, just incredible. And also the attempts to censor criticism. This is extremely dangerous. Inside Turkey, there is a very robust debate going on. People who want to defend the free space of discussion and who are demanding honest political life. How it turns out, we don't know. We know that there is, on the one hand, the natural tendency of politicians to aggrandize themselves, to believe their own press releases about how wonderful and brilliant and genius they are. But on the other hand, there is a very strong Turkish civil society, independent businesses. The Turkish economy has been quite strong because of the growth of independent businesses in the market, as opposed to the Kemalist legacy, which was state socialism and huge dinosaur state-owned companies. And this has generated a much stronger civil society in Greece now because of the dispersion of economic activity among thousands of businesses. There is a robust press and a willingness of people to speak truth to power, as they say, to talk back. How this contest will turn out, I can't really predict. But I do know that there are people, many active libertarians in Turkey, who are fighting against this concentration of power and against the associated aggrandizement of great Turkey that Mr. Erdogan has been promoting. And instead they want to have a normal country, a Turkey that is prosperous, free, and at peace with all of its neighbors. Mr. Erdogan has other ideas, but the Turkish libertarians, I think, are the strongest force criticizing and confronting that.
Another question came into mind. So, because a lot of things that you talked about Erdogan is similar to Putin in Russia. So what came to mind is like actually Erdogan and Putin is like what Plutarch book mentioned is like parallel lives. So do you think that this is like a fair comparison? For me, they're really similar on what they do, what they did both on the economy and the politics, and they stayed too long into power. So is it accurate?
There are parallels, but there are also some differences. I think one of the key differences is that Erdogan actually initiated, let me correct that, continued a liberalization of the Turkish economy that had very, very positive consequences. That goes back to Turgut Özal and the Motherland Party in Turkey. Turkey had an extremely closed economy and, unsurprisingly, was rather poor. They began this process of opening, which continued, and it continued under the AKP, the Erdogan years as well. That's the source of the Turkish prosperity. In contrast, Putin didn't do anything like that. He rode prosperity on the basis of two things. One was a good tax reform, flat tax, a lower tax to 13%, which actually increased tax revenues. That was a good thing, like what was happening in Turkey. But then when oil prices began to go up, he said, who needs rule of law? We have oil. And so you have a rentier state, a state that is based on extraction of rents and its control over oil. This has generated a completely cronyist economy. The best estimate right now is about 70% of the Russian economy is in the hands of the state. Not like it was in the Soviet Union. It's actually quite different. It's not that the state administers companies with some central planning. There's no central planning. These are state-owned firms or firms that are owned by state-owned firms that are used for the extraction of private benefits for the cronies of Mr. Putin, all of his good buddies and friends. People like Yakunin, who has the railroad monopoly, and so these people are the beneficiaries of this state ownership. So it's not centrally planned, but it is a cronyist, state-dominated economy. And now we're seeing the consequences. Oil prices are going down, and they're facing a catastrophe. They're actually beginning to panic quite seriously because they're so dependent on a single commodity price. This would not be true in Turkey. Now, so their paths have been actually quite different. However, the view that is natural to politicians who were in power a long time is, without me, there would be no country. And even Mr. Putin's head of his office said that just a few days ago. He says, no Putin, no Russia. It's an unbelievable arrogance to think a great civilization like Russia depends on the existence of one small biological being, Mr. Vladimir Putin. I think that they do have common interest in creating what Mr. Putin calls a managed democracy, which is to say an autocracy, a kind of modern dictatorship. What's interesting is they have interests that diverge as well. Mr. Putin is a supporter of Hafez al-Assad in Syria, but Mr. Erdogan tried to get rid of him. So there we see, although Putin and Erdogan are creating a kind of an alliance, and Putin is very actively trying to get Erdogan into his camp, in the Syria context, they've had conflicting interests. So this is going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. The politics of this region are immensely complicated, and there are many cross-cutting issues and loyalties and concerns between Iran and the Sunni powers, Hezbollah, the Iraqi government, all of these different governments with their different cross-cutting interests makes it very difficult to create clear-cut alliances, one side and another side, because it's just too complicated.
Let's move to again to another issue. So, like a few days ago, we saw that there were huge protests and even riots in the U.S. because of the Ferguson shooting. And in Peace, Love and Liberty, there is a whole chapter about police militarization in the U.S. and also in other Western countries. Do you think that both the shootings and the protests and riots are connected to this issue?
In a complex way. This is one particular case, one horrible action in one little town in one country, which is rather interesting. So it's dominated the news because the U.S. is a media-saturated country. There's more media per square meter than any place else in the world in the United States. In that context, we had a shooting on two different accounts. The police officer gave one, and the friends of the man shot gave another. That's why you need to have independent procedures to determine what happened. And there was one, and they decided not to indict. Whether it was the correct decision or not, I don't really know, because I was not part of that investigation. One good outcome, I think, is going to be requiring the police to wear cameras. And this is for the protection of the citizen, but also the protection of the police against false accusations. So I think it will create more accountability. I'm very much in favor of this. Well, the issue of militarization of the police came up not in the shooting per se, which was a terrible activity but not a general pattern, but rather the police response to the local protest. They essentially showed up with an army. It was really, really shocking. How could this be on the streets of a small town like that, that you had armored personnel carriers and these men looked like they came out of a science fiction movie. This is not what policing should be about. This was military confrontation with citizens, and I think it's very important to reject that. Policing is about creating peace in the society. In the United States, they used to be called peace officers. That was what police were actually called, a peace officer. Well, they sure don't look like it anymore. Now they look like occupiers or military occupation. So I think that the people in the United States and other countries have become more sensitive to this issue. Militarization of policing is a mistake. Police should be peace officers first. I lived in England some years ago, and the police at that time were still largely unarmed. I really liked that. That made me feel that I was in a more civil country, a civil society, that the police were walking down the street without any firearms. They were there to solve problems, to help people to live in peace. They were peace officers. That's a better model for policing rather than showing up with helicopters and military vehicles and so on to intimidate the population.
What about gun ownership and the right to carry guns in the US? So is it possible to have this right and then have unarmed police? And so how are these issues connected for Greeks and probably Europeans in general? It sounds really strange that any civilian would have the right to carry a gun. It's like a very strange idea for us. And like a lot of people in Europe think that if Americans would make it illegal to own a gun or to carry a gun, then suddenly the problem would be solved. So what do you think about that?
Well, first off, if we go back to the Ferguson case, the only gun was in the hands of the police. There was no firearm in the hands of Michael Brown or others. So this is a case in which I would have favored, if needed, disarming the police rather than the citizens. Police kill so many unarmed citizens, and very, very few police are in fact killed. It is the least dangerous time to be a policeman in history. Being a trash collector is a more dangerous occupation. Yes. But we always hear constantly fears about what a dangerous occupation it is to be a policeman. It is. But in fact, it's less dangerous than it's been in the past. So I think we should be thinking more about disarming the police and having police as mediators and peace officers. From the perspective, though, of an armed citizenry, Switzerland has a staggering amount of firearms in private homes. In fact, it's required because adult males are members of the citizens' militia. They have automatic firearms in their homes, so machine guns. Switzerland has a very, very low crime rate. There is no statistical evidence that the presence of firearms leads to violence. What accounts for violence is a very complicated matter. It has many different causes. But the mere presence of firearms is not it. Indeed, you find in states, when they have liberalized the firearms laws in the United States, those states typically have had faster declines in rates of violence. Now, you wouldn't know it from watching Hollywood movies, which is how most people get their image of other countries. They watch Hollywood movies. Hollywood movies are all about violence. Well, they're about sex, but there's much more sex in the movies than there is in real life. And they're about violence. And there's a lot more violence in movies than in real life as well. Long-term trend, for decades, of violent crime, including murders, have been falling in the United States. So the trend has been very positive, and that has coincided with liberalization of the firearms laws. Now, I'm humble in this regard. I would not assert that the liberalization of the firearms laws caused the decline in violence. These are complicated matters. But those who favor firearms controls, if it had been the case that liberalization had coincided with an increase, they would have immediately claimed, look, see, we showed you. I'm more humble in this. These are complicated matters for sociologists, demographers, and others to study. But there has been a decline in violence during the time that firearms ownership has increased dramatically. So this is a direct contradiction to those who argue that the availability of firearms causes an increase in crime. That claim is wrong. It's absolutely without foundation whatsoever. Now, I do own a firearm. I was involved in a legal case for the right of citizens to own a firearm in the United States. We took it to the Supreme Court and we won. The District of Columbia had banned all functional firearms. You could not have it at all. And then we had the right, was finally recognized, to own them. Crime fell after that. Again, I'm humble. I'm not going to say that's the reason why violence declined. But you can be sure if it had gone up a tiny bit for just 1 week, the other side would have said, see, we warned you. So what firearms are about is the right of people to defend themselves. And people who own firearms for self-defense are more secure. I often ask people who are on the other side of this issue, you know, intelligent, well-meaning people who see it differently. I ask them, if someone breaks into your house, 2 o'clock in the morning, and you're in bed, your children are in bed, which would you rather have in your hand? A firearm or a telephone? And I think everyone knows the answer to that. If you call the police, they will come and they will take a picture of your dead body. And then they'll file a report, and probably they'll never find who did it. If you have a firearm, you have the chance to defend your life. And I have used a firearm in my own personal defense. I'm alive because I had it. I'm very glad I did not have to discharge it, but I used it to defend myself when I was about to be killed, and as a consequence, I'm alive. I'm happy about that. I got 32 more years of life because I was carrying a firearm when I needed it. And to me, that makes it personally important. But even beyond that, as a matter of principle, people have the right to defend themselves. And it does not follow that that right will somehow cause them to be violent. It's just not the case.